Hi everybody, thanks for joining us for this virtual exhibition walkthrough. I'm Sarah Traver, I'm the director of Traver Gallery, and I'm here with our featured artist this month, Andrea Dezsö. And we are thrilled to have Andi's work in the gallery. The show title is Companion Protectors, and this is a new body of work that you've created just during the pandemic.
That's right.
Yeah, and the work exhibited is paper, wood, glass, mixed media, works that are painted, works that are done using hot glass on paper. So we'll look at all of this and hear from Andi about how she approaches her work and the stories behind them. Yeah. So let's start, maybe let's start here with this first tunnel book. Andrea, can you tell us about this piece and then also a little bit about your process in making these pieces and how you came to work this way?
Sure. So these pieces, the tunnel books, this time around are inspired, or I first actually started with hot glass that was rolled on paper and pyrovitriography. And then I created prints out of those. This particular tunnel book started its life as a pyrovitriography print. A version of it is up on the wall. We'll see it later as a pyrovitriography painting. And I created this pyrovitriography because I was, it's called Family Swim, and I was really trying to situate families in ocean spaces, and I try to work with a little bit of this idea of our home in the universe and our homes as members of families within a family, and then the larger family within the universe. And in this case it was the ocean that I was working with, which I see as a universal mother and as a larger scale mother to everybody, all life that comes out of the water and of the ocean. And I'm thinking of all these beings that might be unseen but felt or imagined or believed in or trusted, that might be our companions as we go through life. And so that's how this piece started, and I was feeling that I wasn't quite done with it after I did the pyrovitriography. We did that pyrovitriography. I did a short artist in residence type of engagement at Rhode Island School of Design, where I currently teach in the glass department in the hot shop. And we worked with students who created blanks for us that we rolled on paper hot. And we only were able to make 2 rolls with this particular image because the roll fell off, the blank fell off the rod and broke. So I kind of felt like I wasn't done with the image yet. I didn't quite explore everything I wanted. So I wanted to create a tunnel book around it, and that's how I made this one. This is a combination of laser cut and hand cut tunnel book. I most often hand cut my tunnel books. In this case, I chose to start with laser cutting because I wanted to make a large scale tunnel book on a really substantial, thick watercolor paper, which is so thick it's almost like a wooden board. It's so substantial because I knew I wanted to play with color and with watercolor and immerse the whole paper in water. So it had to be a kind of paper that stands up to any kind of work and demand. And so I started by laser cutting it. At the Rhode Island School of Design, we have a really wonderful CoWorks, which is a digital fabrication lab. And I do a lot of experimental work there. It's really good for research and experimental stuff. And so that's where this started. And because it was done with a laser, I can't quite imagine what it's going to be like when I put it together. So once I put the work together, I realized what more I have to cut out and how to adjust it. And I'm not really interested in multiples, so I don't use the laser cutter to create editions or many things of the same kind. I put in all that work into fabricating in a certain way because I'm interested in certain materials that I couldn't do by hand because of the nature of the material, but I want it to look a certain way. So I do one-of-a-kind pieces using digital technology, and then I intervene by hand.
Yeah, one of the things that I really enjoy about your work, and what I think is really evident in this show in particular, is your approach to materials and how honest you are with them.
Thank you.
Like, I think even just the way that the pieces are constructed on the tunnel books just tells a really wonderful story about your process and your involvement with the materials that you're using, and how you, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, want those materials to be reflective of the narrative of the piece and the characters that you're representing within the work.
Thank you so much for saying that and for noticing that. I really love working with materials, and when I work, I feel that I'm in a conversation with the theme that I'm working with, the content of the work, but I'm also really in conversation with the materials. And I really try to listen to the materials, where they want to go and what they want to do, rather than like going against that. And I'm really not interested in concealing things, so I like to show how something is constructed. I also like when things can be, especially works on paper, when they can be completely taken apart and put back together. So I don't do things that are irreversible with paper, especially. So this stuff can be like, the strings can be cut and it can be reassembled. And the other thing is that materials are so much in conversation with each other and also with what is made with them in my world. So on one hand, it's an exploration of the topic that I'm working with, but also it's a kind of time spent in the studio getting to know materials and what they do. And that's just such a sensuous pleasure of really working with very nice, very good materials, and to just like trying to get a really deep understanding of who they are and what they want to do.
Can we take a look at some of the next piece in the exhibition? Is actually a wood piece, which is a new material for you.
So this happened during the COVID lockdown, and it was such a time of loneliness and of not really knowing where we are going to come out on the other side. And I had a few little snippets of really wonderful Japanese paper, handmade paper, that I didn't want to throw away. They were these little strips. And because I didn't know when, if ever, we are going to go back to a life where we can, buy the paper we want. And so I wanted to hold on to every scrap of paper. And one day, as I was just sitting in the studio, I started cutting out these small beings by hand. And I realized that they belong to families, and then I started cutting out more and more. And they became my companions during this time. And as I was cutting them out, I realized that they were very small because the paper was small, but it felt like they had more energy than the size that they were in, and they wanted to grow and become bigger and take up more space. And I started playing with the idea of making these out of wood. And because I've never worked with wood before, starting to use the laser cutter was really an entry way for me into wood. What I've done before is Mokuhanga, which is Japanese woodblock printing, which I only started also during COVID. I started like carving wood blocks, but I knew that I wanted these pieces to be cut through like a real silhouette. And I didn't know how to use saws and machines of any kind. So I thought that cutting them out with a laser cutter will get me the closest to where the original paper cuts were, because it can do such tiny, tiny detail. And I cut them out with a laser cutter. And then I started sanding them and coloring them and intervening with color a lot. And after a while of having worked with them, I realized that they are all in these frames. How we were in all these frames whenever we had to interact with anybody. You saw this, like on Zoom, you saw this like array of frames, and everybody sitting at home in their frames. And I was thinking, wow, this really translated without me realizing. I really had to see the work before I knew that something came through from that separateness.
Now that you say that, I totally can see the, like, looking at my laptop screen, and here's
so
like
weird, right?
like 12 different people on a screen, all talking to each other, all trying to find some sort of point of connection during this weird pandemic reality.
Yeah, and so I made them, and they belong to different families because I was cutting out like 5 or 6 of them at a time from the paper. And so I realized that the ones I cut at the same time belong to the same family. They had similar features, but slightly different. And I was thinking a lot about family and being apart, and how are we going to redefine our relationships, how long this is going to take. I haven't seen my son for over 2 years during that time, so it was really a weird, difficult time. But there was also a lot of beauty in being in nature and being with these materials, and this offered a lot of really positive energy to go back to.
Let's keep walking and see the rest of the show. Can you, as we're walking through, you're originally from Transylvania.
That's right.
And have been an artist, I think, your whole life.
Yes.
How can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you sort of identify as an artist and how you have come to do this work?
Yes, sure. So I am from Transylvania. I grew up in Cluj, in Kolozsvár, Klausenburg in German, and I grew up in a block, an apartment building block, which was at the edge of the forest. And this kind of defined the way I grew up, because I grew up on one hand in this very weird totalitarian society where everybody was suspicious of everybody else, and you have to be very careful of what you said to whom and how you interacted with the human world. But that human world was really encompassed within the natural world. The forest was all around us, and so there was this idea of there's something much bigger and much longer term than regimes and then worlds of the human kind of invention. And nature offered a lot of solace and a lot of inspiration. And growing up, I was really inspired by folk art of any kind, like folk tales, songs, and visual art of all kinds of materials, using all kinds of materials, colors, and how people who were not identifying as artists necessarily or didn't do art training created these amazing, gorgeous works that were then passed down through the generations. And a lot of women did a lot of really inspiring work in textiles and in embroidery, and a lot of grandmothers who worked out in the fields and didn't think of themselves as artists created these whole entire worlds in their house. Sometimes they painted all their walls with those motifs and the furniture, and filled them with the pillows and all that kind of stuff. And so I felt that there is another way of life even within human society. It doesn't have to be this rigid, suspicious, communist kind of march ahead into a big lie, but you could live a really dignified and life full of inspiration and full of making things that are beautiful and living in the midst of that. And so that kind of really defined my world and my artwork. And I'm always really inspired by the artwork of people who don't necessarily identify as artists, who are not members of the sanctioned art world or the art education system, but who just feel a very strong calling to do what they do, and they are kind of outsiders in their topics, in how they work, in what they do. They are not really defined by what am I supposed to be like as an artist.
It's interesting, I think for me certainly, and for a lot of people that I've seen encounter your work, there's people have that point of reference with folk art, like that comes through very strongly, although what you're representing is not necessarily a particular style of folk art or a particular cultural narrative. It seems very much like your own imagined space.
Yes, that's what I'm doing. I think I'm trying to kind of follow my own world where it wants to develop and kind of really listen to what that says and where it wants to go. But the inspiration is from people who have done that before me and who kind of are doing it their own way. And I don't know, I think it's not so much like I saw folk art and that inspired me, so I wanted to follow that path. I feel that there was this kind of similarity, this kind of affinity between my vision or my taste, even at an early age. Kind of what really moved me was that kind of world and that kind of way of making art and that kind of narrative, because I wanted to go that way, and here were people who are doing that, and so that kind of gave me also the freedom to like just do my own thing,
go
because
forward
they
with
did
it.
their own thing, which was so liberating.
So can you tell us about this piece?
Yes, this piece also started as a pyrovitriography print, and this was also one of my recent pyrovitriography prints that I did at the RISD glass department, and there is one on the wall like that. It's these meeting points. It's this place where people from different worlds meet, and where the world itself and the inhabitants of the world seem to be made from the same materials and belong in the same world. I'm trying to kind of work from the body and from sensations and feelings and the energy, rather than have a conceptual idea of this is what it's going to be, but just start with a particular sensation and let that guide me into the imagery, and that's how this one was created.
Do you have like a daily sketching practice, or how do you kind of capture these images?
I have a daily sketching practice, but I don't use my sketches so much to create then artwork. I have a sketching practice to stay in touch with that part of me that does the work, which is not the part that says this is going to be a disaster, you shouldn't even do this. Because there's that very strong voice also, no matter how long I've been doing it, that okay, it might have worked up to this point, but this one is surely gonna fail because you've never done this before. And so, yeah, I have a daily sketching practice, and I draw things that I see on one hand, mostly in my garden these days, or out in nature. It's a practice of paying attention and being in that image that I'm in, and it's kind of like a practice of concentration and of presence. And once I'm in that practice, so that I'm engaging with that part of myself and that part of the world and that part of attention every day, it's much easier to then sit down and make something. But I don't really use my sketches for the most part to...
They're not reference material for future artworks. It's just
it's
keeping
just like
your brain,
practice,
a practice, almost like a meditation.
Like a meditation practice, yes. Not a practice to like how to draw, because I feel that if I don't sweat it, I actually can draw. But the moment I'm like, okay, now
now draw
showtime,
this.
then it's like really
Yeah.
uptight and it becomes like self-conscious.
Yeah. So we have a few other of the wood pieces here. Maybe you can.
Yeah.
When you think about these characters, I know you said something to me about this piece earlier about each of the backgrounds on these ones are so detailed and intricate. And can you talk a little bit about how you were approaching that?
Sure. So I wanted to have these characters in their worlds. I wanted each person, each character, each companion or friend, protector, to belong to their own kind of house or composition. So they are each in their own cell almost, or in their own frame. And behind them, you can see their world or their home. And I don't mean to like do too many direct analogies with like seeing into people's homes when you talk to them on the screen, but you do, I mean, I kind of do think about that a little bit when I see this, how before I could never imagine seeing into my coworkers' kitchens or bedrooms or wherever their screen
and
might
there's
be.
their dog in the background,
But
or their
this is
husband or wife.
Exactly, but this is what it is, where you actually get to know people on a different layer or different level. You see all these layers behind them. Well, I was really interested in reconciling just materials-wise and visually these two kinds of ways of making images. On one hand, creating these cut-through silhouettes, and on another hand, creating silhouettes that are a very shallow relief and are painted. And I really was very curious about how collaging would work in wood and how you can assemble things together in a way that it becomes sculptural. And this is how I went about that.
So these actually are different wood surfaces that are applied together, collaged.
On one hand, there are the small square pieces, 3 inches by 3 inches each, that have a very shallow laser engraved surface, which I later painted, sanded, worked on so that it gave that kind of more like worn in look and more kind of a kind of painted shallow relief look that I was after. And they are combined with these pieces of the characters, of the protectors and friends, which are completely cut through. They are a thicker wood, and I also played with some of them are 1/8 of an inch and some of them 1/4 of an inch. So
they
there's
kind of move back and forth
relief in there too.
Beautiful.
Thank you. So that's the pyrovitriography print that I made. That was the basis of the tunnel book.
So essentially the pyrovitriography, so you're essentially, you work in the hot shop with a glass blower to blow a blank, right? And that's a cylinder.
Yes.
And then you'll take that cylinder back to your studio when it's cold and do design work that's then etched into that surface.
Right. Yes, I cover it with buttercut with a vinyl. I cut into that, then I sandblast them so that there's a deep etch on it. Then we heat it back up and we get it in the glory hole, so it's super, super hot, and then we roll it on paper. And the way it works is we do several rolls, and because the cylinder starts to become really soft and melts, as we roll it, it torques, so the image actually changes with every roll. So there are not two of any of these that are the same, even though they are from the same cylinder, because the more you roll, the more unrecognizable your figures
stretched
are.
out.
Exactly, it stretches,
morphed.
it moves. And that's one thing that I really like about it, that it looks really alive, like there's like writhing and moving and turning and changing. And so then I look at them and I intervene with color. I do watercolor on them, and I complete some of the imagery that are only maybe just half printed. And those are also, I kind of see that also as this dialogue of I get incomplete image, and it's up to me of how I complete
fill in
that.
and
Yeah, it's like when you're looking at the clouds and you see different images in there, but they're constantly moving. That's kind of how I see these.
So each one of the pyrovitreographs, so this is one side of the cylinder and it rolls across,
Right.
and so I'm seeing maybe the same figure
The same figure might come
up here
again,
a
but
couple
they're
times.
slightly different.
Yeah.
Like this one and that one, and that one might be the same. And then I rolled it also. I turned the paper around. I rolled it upside down, so you can see that this figure might appear 6 times, but they're all different characters ultimately because of the torque and also of how I completed it.
They're really wonderful.
Thank you.
The level, the detail in the paintings is really extraordinary. There's just so much to discover as you look at them. There's sort of an initial image, I think, that you see when you approach the work, and then as you stand and spend time with it, there's just all of this other sort of quiet shadow imagery that starts to emerge, and these characters and faces that they're just incredibly evocative.
Thank you so much. These paintings in the middle, they don't have pyrovitriography. They are
These are just strictly watercolor?
watercolor. And I really wanted to see what happens if you do the same image many times. If you can do it, if it keeps having energy and if it keeps being interesting to work with. I was thinking of Edward Hicks, who created the Peaceable Kingdom, who was an American Quaker painter who painted a single image his whole life, and he painted it hundreds of times. It's this Peaceable Kingdom image. There's still 64 of them currently in existence. There's one at the Metropolitan Museum, there's in various museums, but the image always slightly changed. The first one is kind of his most maybe least ambitious one, and as he gained confidence and skill and zeal, he made them more and more complicated and sophisticated and added more animals and that kind of stuff. And I was working with a project last year, 2 years ago, before COVID, that focused on that painting. So it kept me thinking of like, what is it like to paint a single image many times, and how does that change? And so there were these heads for me that I started to work on during my last sabbatical in Hawaii during lockdown. I was thinking of grandmothers, mothers, and daughters, and how one generation basically gives life to the next generation, and how people come out of other people. And I wanted to make this image, and after I've done it once, I felt like I wasn't done. And then I started to become curious, like, okay, what's next? And what's really interesting here is how you put them up in order. Like the bottom one is the one I made earlier, and the middle one I made later, and the top one I made the latest. And I was curious where it's going. I have 4 of them. The very first one, I didn't include the show that I used the wrong side of the paper. So I was like, what's wrong with this piece? And I realized that I did it on the reverse of the paper. But then I'm not sure if I'm done at this point with them. This was one of those paintings where I was always working on something, and then I came back to this painting, and it was always, there was always one in the works somewhere. So when I wanted to take a step away from something else, I did the heads again. It was a practice.
That's wonderful.
Thank you.
Well, we've used a lot of our time, so I think I want to just maybe focus on 1 or 2 other pieces. Are there particular things that you want to point out in this exhibition?
Maybe we can look at a little bit at the Mokuhanga print paintings. So these ones I carved by hand, Mokuhanga Japanese wood blocks. Also during the lockdown, during my last sabbatical in Hawaii. And I first started to make Mokuhanga. Again, it was one of those entry points where I wanted to do it for a long time and I didn't know how to carve wood. And I started some years ago by doing laser cut pieces and then printing them, and kind of got a feel of how this goes. And I got so interested based on that that I wanted to learn how to carve by hand. And Hiroki Morinue in Holualoa, Hawaii, taught me how to carve actual traditional shina wood Mokuhanga by hand. He's an amazing Mokuhanga artist, printmaker, and he's also a painter. And so after I studied with him, I started to carve my own Mokuhanga. And here again, I'm not really interested in making editions. So what I wanted to do is create a large library of images of these characters at different sizes and different background elements, and then using them almost as stamps or as collage, kind of like with the wood pieces in the exhibition, where I have a bunch of things and then I play with them and I compose with them. And I wanted them to be the basis of painting. So I wanted to put down some of these woodblock prints. These are all on Japanese handmade paper, either kitakata or shino. And then I wanted to see what color they are asking for or where they wanted to go. And so then I painted on them with vinyl paint or with watercolor, and that's how these paintings came to be.
Have you always kind of evolved your art making practice like this? It seems like you're really experimenting with new materials and new techniques, and is that just always been part of your practice, is to just always be exploring?
Yes, because I'm really curious, and when I see something, I get an idea of what if you did it this way. And oftentimes when I ask somebody, they are not sure, because it's usually not like the traditional thing that's done with that particular medium or technique. And people have been super generous in teaching me how the traditional stuff works, or how you have to do woodworking, or how do you actually glue two things together, or all these kinds of things. And then I've also been just really fortunate that I was always just left alone to then, when I acquired that basic understanding of how something works, then do my thing, which is something completely different. But materials and various studio spaces and various kinds of working environments and materials just so inspire me that that's something that I feel really alive around, and I want to engage with them and to get to know them and to get to use them. I love tools, and I love everything that's about the material world. So yeah, that's how I make stuff.
So what are you working on in the studio now?
I just finished a really wonderful 2-day residency at the Museum of Glass in Tacoma, and we did a lot of pyrovitriography prints with hot glass. So I'm really looking forward to on really big and really heavy paper, watercolor paper. So I'm really looking forward to painting those. And that's kind of the next thing that I'm planning to do. One day I would love to try weaving and tapestry. That's something that I've never done before, and I would just really,
I think your work really lends itself to that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so
I'm
much.
excited to see that. Well, we'll of course video all of the work in the exhibition. Are there any other things that you'd like to point out to the audience before we kind of sign off?
Just that I'm so excited to be here in person with all of you and to meet you for the
I
first
know,
time in
it's
real
amazing.
life.
So the first show that we did with Andi was in 2020.
That's right.
in the summer of 2020, and we didn't get to do, we had planned this huge
Right.
sort of installation-based exhibit, and of course you guys couldn't come out and help with the
Yes.
installation, so we did a quick pivot and we had a beautiful, beautiful show. But we didn't get to spend time together and
Yeah.
actually have this kind of in-person experience, and so it really is really special to have this show in the gallery and have you guys in town and be able to celebrate together.
This has been wonderful. I have almost not been able to sleep. I was so excited and so happy that we were here together, and it's just much more special than anything that I can remember, because I feel like it's almost like not having a birthday for 2 years and then people coming
Yeah,
together.
and celebrating.
Celebrating
Yeah,
together.
and that's right, because in 2019 you had spent some time at Pilchuck as an
right.
artist in residence, and
Yes.
so also got to know a lot of our community here in the Pacific Northwest, our glass community and our maker community here.
Yes, and we had plans. We had
yeah.
plans for 2020. We were supposed to go with Dante to Hawaii and do a residency at the University of
Yeah.
Manoa in printmaking
So
and
it's
glass, and so we couldn't do that.
A lot of unfinished business.
Yeah, a lot of stuff that just didn't happen
Yeah.
that now starts to come back to life, which is wonderful.
Well, thank you so much, Andrea, for sharing your work with us, and it really, I mean, I feel very happy to get to live with these companions and protectors for this month, and their stories just emerge and they seem to come to life here in the gallery. So
Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Sarah. Thank you for the
Thanks everyone for
opportunity.
joining us.